Hi, I'm Alex. I use any pronouns, and I'm an editor at ANU Observer.
Hello, my name's also Alex. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the news editor at Waroni. Before we begin today's debate, we'd like to acknowledge that it's been hosted on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands. We'd like to pay our respects to traditional elders, past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to acknowledge that Waroni is a name stolen from the Wadi Wadi language, and that in the future we're striving to do better for reconciliation.
For those of you who don't know, ANUSA is the Australian National University Student Association for Undergraduate Students and is a $2 million organisation. They use staff funding to provide services and advocate for student interests.
Today's debate is between two candidates for the General Secretary position, Phoenix O'Neill and Samuel McRae. The General Secretary is responsible for hosting and chairing ANUSA's meetings, as well as ensuring that ANUSA abides its own constitution and its own policies.
I'm Phoenix O'Neill. I use they or she pronouns, and I'm running for General Secretary of ANUSA with Power in Community. I'm very, very excited this year. I was clubs officer of ANUSA, so I already have ANUSA executive experience. In particular, I really loved working on the clubs regulations this year. I completely rewrote them, and what I loved about that was making ANUSA more accessible and less bureaucratic through policy, and I think that that's something that really drove me to run for this role so that I can continue to do that next year.
Fantastic. Sam, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Samuel McRae. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm running for General Secretary of ANUSA this year. I am currently a Gen Rep on ANUSA this year, and I'm running with Action for ANUSA this year. And we're running to, I'm running to hopefully make the SRC, continue the good work of the SRC to make it even more accessible, even more welcoming, and even more exciting place for students to want to be involved in, and running to, bring fresh new ideas this year.
Yep. This year, some students have criticised ANUSA meetings for being inaccessible, with protracted debates and hard-to-follow procedures. How do you plan to address this? You have 1.5 minutes.
I plan on addressing it by just doing little changes, I think, once, if elected. Basically, pretty much trying to expand the accessibility of debates, especially in those times, beyond Facebook, maybe utilising more emails, especially. Those little kind of changes I think would be quite important in just making people aware there is a meeting happening. As for drawn out debates, I don't think necessarily that long debate meetings are a problem. I think that obviously that, a meeting running till 10:30 p.m, that's unfortunate. But if everybody wants to speak, has a chance to speak, I think that's very important. In terms of, people abusing, repeating speaking, I don't necessarily think I think that there's like a decision that a chair would have to make in that moment about, people taking advantage of speakers. But, it's most important, I think, that everybody will have the opportunity to speak. And that's just the way meetings can go. And I think that's just very important that we have, meetings where everybody can have a chance to speak, and as long as needs be, and not unnecessarily protracted. But yeah, that's what I would have to say that. But just important on having meetings be very accessible, and yeah.
Yeah, awesome. I wanted to just open my first part by doing an acknowledgement of country for Ngunnawal and Ngambri people where this debate is taking place, and in particular acknowledging that, bureaucracy and governance comes from a colonial structure, and that is something that we have to work to do and have an obligation to work to undo while living on unceded lands. In terms of the question on notice, in terms of protracted debates, I do agree that it's inappropriate for the General Secretary to decide what the SRC or what students can discuss, what they should be discussing, and it's also undemocratic for me to decide who gets to speak on those issues as well. They're long because students want to speak, like Sam's already mentioned, particularly because ANUSA is a political and an activist body. Having political and activist conversations is important. However, that also means that ANUSA has an obligation to educating students about these political and activist issues so that students can understand when they're coming into a meeting what we are talking about. And oftentimes people do come into full-on political debates and aren't quite sure what's going on. We need to take a step back and explain these things to people, make sure that it's a safe space for people to ask questions, which I have a policy on reforming the Code of Conduct, where I want the SRC to talk about their values and the kind of things that they want to see at meetings, such as a safer space to ask questions, that kind of thing. And yeah, efficiency and productivity are important. They can suggest closing the speaking list. In terms of hard to follow procedures, again, that's another thing that we have an obligation to explain to students.
All right, fantastic. So Sam, do you want to exercise your right to reply, or are you happy with what you've said?
Yeah, I mean, it was a long question. I would definitely say that, yeah, the chair, it's very important that the chair would obviously, it's okay to just pause a meeting and, explain any procedural motions. I mean, on the SRC this year, we've had sometimes, motions had to be moved around and changed, or, standing orders wouldn't allow a certain motion. And I found that the current General Secretary was very helpful in that, and that should continue always, whoever is elected General Secretary.
All right, thank you. So, Phoenix, how do you plan to increase meeting attendance and to increase engagement with the NUSA's working committees?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that something that is very exciting for me is that as clubs officer, I've been thinking about how to get people involved with the NUSA all year, in terms of trying to get people to come to events. I'm not above standing on Uni Ave and telling people about what's going on, as I was doing with Friday Night Party just now. In terms of, I think the simple answer, honestly, is people come to meetings and people come to these working groups when we're working on something that they care about. This year we saw a huge turnout, for example, to the AGM, where I was putting forward clubs regulations that I consulted with clubs. It's because they knew that it was within their interests to come and to talk about the motion, to propose amendments. Or, for example, trigger warning for SASH, but the August 1st SGM is the largest meeting NUSA has had in years, in recent memory, 500 people. It's because people care about those issues, right? And that was still a NUSA meeting. We voted on things, it was a protest as well, and I think that was amazing that it was both. But making sure that people understand why the issues at hand at a meeting or at a working group, why that is related to their interests and why they should care. That's something that is, I think, of utmost importance. And I have a lot of policy on how I can communicate that, such as collaborating with student media. But yeah.
Right, Sam.
Absolutely. I think that there's been some very big NUSA meetings happening this year, AGMs and SGMs. The turnout for a lot of those has been quite incredible. Turnout for normal, regular meetings like SRC meetings definitely can improve. And as General Secretary, I would look into ways, maybe collaborating with clubs or, something with some certain societies or clubs, intro to a NUSA, how to get involved with the NUSA, because we have a lot of political-minded students at ANU, really great. But, it's really quite funny that the turnout or the participation in NUSA isn't that high, and it seems that, a club attendance, and there's so many clubs at ANU, that we can do a lot more to really engage a NUSA with the clubs instead of a NUSA being standalone. And definitely, I really like Fee's policy about engaging with student media. And definitely, I think a lot of the times too, sometimes in a NUSA meeting can kind of creep up on people, and that it can come kind of out of the blue. And I think it's very important that a General Secretary would have to, give a lot of notice and make sure that people can even know that there's a meeting or even how to attend. And especially also keeping up attendance, keeping up the hybrid model of meetings will be very important going forward as we're leaving the pandemic. I think that's something that people have enjoyed a lot.
Fee, would you like to exercise your right to reply?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree that a hybrid model is one of the best ways to increase attendance and accessibility at meetings. And one last thing I suppose I want to acknowledge as well is that using meetings as the sole way for students to get involved in a NUSA is not, I don't think, for a student to be involved in a NUSA's advocacy, they have to necessarily come to meetings. There's a lot of other groups, there's a lot of activism that they can get involved in, they can get involved in our events, that kind of thing. It's important to acknowledge that meetings and governance and those kinds of things, they're not necessarily for everyone, even though we should also be trying to make them for as many people as possible.
This year, 2 college rep positions have already been filled by default. Participation, not just in voting, in student elections, appears to be declining. How will you galvanise students to run for more NUSA positions, Sam?
I do find it very. I did find it really annoying, disheartening that there were 2 unelected positions. I mean, it was 1 last year and 2 this year. It was quite, it's not what we want, in terms of student democracy, student government, that kind of student union. I definitely think that there probably needs to be that little bit more advertisement, especially maybe interacting with, the colleges themselves and advertising these positions. I know that they do a lot of work, for their individual, say, how they advertise, class reps for their courses. Something like that, where the college reps, they're representing the college and the student union. I think that there's a little bit more interaction that we could do in just advertising these positions, especially for the CAP, which is now for the 2nd year, or maybe even 30. the number a couple times now in the last couple of years has been filled just by default, and that needs to be worked on. I think just more reaching out to students, especially however means necessary.
In particular, because we are talking about college reps, I think there needs to be better communication on what the college rep role entails. It's not the same as an admin staff member for the college, right? Like, it's someone who, for example, our CAS college reps got really involved in the CAS course cuts campaign. There's a lot of space for activism. There's a lot of space for engagement. Our JCOS reps run the National Youth Science Week, for example, so there's a lot of room for events. So understanding that it's not just the role is not limited to a scope of just like replying to students' emails about their courses. In terms of elections in general and engagement in elections, I have a policy about the kind of feedback that I want to be seeking. I want to do forms and speak to 3 different groups: students, candidates, and student media about their experiences. What was kind of stopping them from campaigning? Like, was it the financial regulations around campaigning? Was it the campaign zones? What made it difficult for people to get involved? So I elaborate a lot more on that in my policy. It's quite a long one, so I can't get entirely into it here. But I think understanding those barriers is a huge part of it as well.
Great. Sam, would you like a 30-second round of play?
Sure, yeah, and just as a general secretary, I feel like it would be very important to even just ask, or even investigate, the inherent problems of, the role of maybe why people don't even want to run for a college rep position, and maybe what can be adjusted with the college rep position that makes it more appealing for people to run.
Yeah. Okay, so we're now moving into the specific questions. So something that we mightn't have mentioned earlier is, if you would like, we can give you a 15-second break just to kind of jot down some ideas regarding these questions.
That would be great.
Yeah, of course. So, so Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
General representatives have not passed many motions at ANUSA meetings and do tend to vote with the executive. How will you encourage representatives to speak on behalf of students, even if that means disagreeing with the ANUSA executive?
So, as someone who's been a gen rep before, and same with Sam, I definitely, when I was a gen rep, had this experience of not feeling quite confident writing a motion, not feeling quite confident speaking against the executive or that kind of thing. In my policy, I talk a lot about the ways that we can improve that culture. First of all is the code of conduct that I've already talked about a little bit, but setting the culture where it's okay to do that. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not something you can do just by writing it down on a piece of paper, but having those discussions with the SRC about setting that culture is the first step. I also have policy about having Gen Rep working bees every fortnight or so during semester time. So this would look like the General Secretary, any executive member who's free, any Gen Reps or college reps who are free, coming together and talking about their projects, talking about what they work on. What that can mean is, if a motion is appropriate for a Gen Rep project and for what they want to achieve, the Gen Sec can help them with writing it then and there on the spot. Having a few other ideas that I touch on in my policy are having more planning days, and I talk about that with my Vice President candidate Grace King. More education on the issues. A lot of SRC members walk in not being quite sure how they feel about an issue, so it's much easier to vote with the executive, and I think that we have an obligation to help them understand those things. And in general, just improving our training for our representatives at the beginning of the year. But yeah, this is something I've thought a lot about because I struggled with it a lot when I was a gen rep myself, and I want to make that culture better.
Fantastic. Sam, you have 30 seconds to add something on to Phoenix's response.
Absolutely. I think as a Gen Rep coming into this year, I think that there was a lot of good orientation sessions that we were able to have and be reintroduced to ANUSA. I definitely think, especially with the process of the ANUSA PASA process, we've had a lot of consultations as an SRC, and I, as a Gen Rep this year, felt very welcome, and to express my opinion. And it was really enabled to by taking down the standards a bit and letting people speak a bit more, but just continuing more programs and more orientation, and maybe working on the buddy system to work a little bit better to not be so much
Thanks.
Sam, you've promised to bring back the live blogging and live streaming of ANUSA meetings. Previously, this was done by student media. How do you plan to achieve this in-house, and what resources will ANUSA devote to it? You've got 15 seconds to think about that.
So I think that policy is definitely not closed to working with Student Media, Waroni and Observer on how they can come back and bring in live blogging. The resources themselves, it would have to be looked at, once elected, you know, what resources ANUSA would have to even do it in-house if they could, or whether we would have to work with student media. Not even necessarily just live video recordings, it could be, you know, just live reporting, just little things like that instead of, you know, post-meeting write-up, a live blog. I think bringing those live blogs back would, I think, make it a lot more engaging, I think, for students to keep up with.
Fee, do you have 30 seconds to add something onto that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the most important resource that ANUSA can give to student media, in my opinion, is our time and our training. Like, student media is improved when we, your understanding of ANUSA is improved when we dedicate time to helping you guys out with understanding that. And I talk a lot about how in my policy that is the one way to engage students in ANUSA is through student media. So we have to develop a good relationship.